If you lived in Britain any time between 1962 and 1982, chances are you saw a Ford Cortina almost every single day. It was in supermarket car parks, company fleets, suburban driveways, and family holiday photos. It wasn't a supercar, it wasn't a luxury car, and it certainly wasn't built to become an icon. On paper, it was almost painfully ordinary. A practical saloon for sales reps, middle-class families, and company drivers who needed something cheap, roomy, and easy to run. And yet, over a 20-year production run, the Cortina sold more than 4.3 million units worldwide, dominated Britain's sales charts for years, and became one of the most familiar cars the country had ever known. So, how did one of Britain's most ordinary cars become a national icon? To understand that, you actually have to start in Detroit, not Dagenham. In the early 1960s, Ford in America was developing a compact saloon project codenamed Cardinal. It was a fairly ambitious idea for its time, with front-wheel drive and a V4 engine. But Detroit ultimately decided not to build it. Instead, the project was handed over to Ford of Germany, where it evolved into the Taunus 12M. But while that was happening, Sir Patrick Hennessy, head of Ford UK, saw the Cardinal concept and immediately believed Britain needed a car in that segment. Instead of working with Germany, Ford UK did something very Ford-like. For the era, it decided to build its own rival from scratch. That British project became the Ford Cortina, originally developed under the codename Archbishop, and its creation was shaped by a surprisingly dramatic team. One of the key designers was Roy Brown Jr., the same man responsible for the disastrous American Edsel. After the Edsel's failure, Brown had effectively been exiled to Britain, but in that supposed dead end of his career, he helped create one of the most successful cars Ford would ever sell in Europe, and the speed of development was extraordinary. Ford pushed the Cortina from concept to production in roughly 20 months, an incredibly short time for an all-new car. But despite the rush, the company knew exactly what it wanted: a lightweight, practical family saloon with a decent boot, sensible running costs, and broad appeal to both private buyers and company fleets. When the Cortina Mk1 launched in September 1962, it wasn't especially powerful. Early cars used a 1.2-liter Kent engine, took around 22 seconds to reach 60 mph, and topped out at roughly 75 mph. But that was never the point. The Cortina's advantage was its simplicity. It was light, which meant it used less metal, cost less to build, and could undercut rivals on price. It was roomy enough for family holidays, practical enough for sales reps, and modern enough to feel like a sensible choice. Even the name was chosen with care. Cortina was inspired by Cortina d'Ampezzo, the famous Italian resort town, and Ford would later continue that Mediterranean naming theme with cars like the Capri and Granada. What made the Cortina especially clever was that Ford positioned it exactly where the British market wanted it. It arrived alongside the larger Consul Classic, but the Cortina was lighter, cheaper, and more useful. Buyers immediately understood it, and then, in 1963, Ford did something that transformed the Cortina from sensible family transport into something much more exciting. It partnered with Lotus. The result was the Lotus Cortina, a car that completely changed the Cortina's image. Under the hood sat a 1,558cc twin-cam engine, producing around 105 horsepower, paired with a close-ratio gearbox. It was light, fast, and suddenly, the Cortina wasn't just Britain's practical family car, it was a motorsport weapon. Jim Clark used it to dominate the 1964 British Saloon Car Championship, and the image of a Lotus Cortina lifting its inside front wheel through corners became one of the most famous sights in 1960s British racing. Drivers like Graham Hill and Jackie Ickx also got behind the wheel, and the Lotus Cortina gave the whole Cortina line something priceless: cool factor. It pulled buyers into Ford showrooms and proved the Cortina could be more than just ordinary. Ford followed that success with the Cortina Mk2 in 1966, and this is where the Cortina truly became Britain's default family car. The Mk2 was slightly shorter than the Mk1 but wider, which meant a more spacious interior and a bigger boot, exactly what Cortina buyers wanted. The styling looked more American, almost like a scaled-down Ford Falcon, and Ford also added practical touches, like child locks and wraparound rear lights. The British public loved it. By 1967, the Cortina had overtaken the Austin Morris 1100 to become the best-selling car in Britain, and more than 1 million Mk2s were built in just 4 years. The Mk2 also expanded the Cortina's personality. At one end, there was still the Lotus Cortina. At the other, Ford introduced the 1600E, essentially a Cortina for buyers who wanted a little luxury with their performance. It featured upgraded suspension, a more powerful 1.6-liter engine, walnut dashboard trim, bucket seats, a leather-wrapped steering wheel, and other touches that made it feel almost executive. If the Lotus Cortina was the racing hero, the 1600E was the stylish company car with a touch of class. But while Britain was embracing the Cortina, the car was also taking on different lives around the world. It was built in places like Australia, South Africa, the Netherlands, Taiwan, Portugal, Ireland, Singapore, and even South Korea under Hyundai license. In the United States, a small number of Cortinas were imported, but the car never made much impact there and disappeared by 1970. In South Africa, however, the Cortina evolved into something much wilder. Basil Green Motors dropped a 3.0-liter Essex V6 into the car, creating the Piranha, a family saloon-turned-muscle machine. South Africa also got a pickup version, known locally as a bakkie, which eventually evolved into the Ford P100. In Australia, Ford went in another direction and stuffed big Falcon 6-cylinder engines into the Cortina. It sounded exciting, but the extra weight hurt handling, and the Cortina never enjoyed the same dominance there that it did in Britain. Back in Europe, Ford was starting to realize that building two separate mid-size cars, the British Cortina and the German Taunus, made less and less sense. The answer was the TC project, short for Taunus Cortina, which began to unify the two lines. That process really took shape with the Cortina Mk3, launched in 1970. The Mk3 was a major leap forward. It adopted a larger body with more interior space, extra rear legroom, and styling heavily influenced by Detroit, including Coke bottle body lines, similar to those seen on contemporary American Fords. Ford also killed off the Corsair, making the Cortina larger so it could fill the gap in the range. Mechanically, the Mk3 introduced a new 2.0-liter Pinto overhead cam engine, and its suspension was completely reworked. With double wishbones up front and coil springs at the rear, the result was a softer, more refined ride than the Mk2. But the launch wasn't perfect. Early Mk3s suffered from poorly fitted doors, wind noise, vibration issues, and suspension tuning that many reviewers found too bouncy. Then, in 1971, a major strike at Ford's plant wiped out around 100,000 cars from production. Oddly enough, that disruption may have helped the Cortina because it gave Ford time to fix many of the early issues before volumes ramped back up. Once those teething problems were ironed out, the Cortina returned to doing what it did best, selling in huge numbers. By 1972, it was once again Britain's best-selling car, with the Ford Escort close behind. Those two Fords would dominate the top of the sales charts for much of the next decade, and Ford kept refining the formula. In 1976, the Cortina Mk4 arrived, looking sharper and more conservative than the Coke bottle Mk3. This was the point where the Cortina and Taunus were finally brought much closer together, differing mostly in badges and market-specific details. The top trim level became the Ghia, adding a touch of aspiration to a car that was still, at heart, designed for ordinary families and company drivers. By 1979, Ford introduced the Cortina 80, effectively the final major evolution of the Mk5. It brought a new roof, larger windows, better trim, slightly bigger headlights, and much-needed improvements in rust-proofing. But rust was already one of the Cortina's biggest problems. Owners often complained that corrosion could appear frighteningly early, and by the time Mk5 cars were a few years old, rust had become one of the main reasons so few survive today. There were also mechanical complaints, especially around overhead cam lubrication issues on some engines, but none of it was enough to kill the Cortina's popularity. Even near the end, Britain kept buying them. In 1979, the Cortina recorded its highest sales year ever, with nearly 194,000 cars sold, capturing over 11% of the entire UK market. And that tells you everything about why the Cortina mattered. It wasn't because it was perfect. It clearly wasn't. It rusted. Some versions had mechanical weaknesses. Some interiors were criticized for feeling cheap, and in certain export markets, it never really took off. But Ford understood its buyers better than almost anyone else. The Cortina had to be affordable, roomy, easy to drive, cheap to run, and updated just often enough to stay current. It also needed halo versions like the Lotus Cortina and 1600 to give the whole range aspiration. Ford got that formula exactly right, over and over again. By the early 1980s, though, Ford knew the Cortina formula couldn't last forever. The replacement was already waiting. The far more aerodynamic, far more modern Ford Sierra. Thanks.